So our next speaker in this room is going to be Matt Sweney from Utah. He's the chairman of our medical advisory board, and he's going to talk to us about well, he'll talk to us about cannabis oil. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, it's going to be enlightening, I'm sure. Thanks, everybody. I'm Matt Sweney. I'm a pediatric epilepsy doc in Salt Lake City. I'm the medical director of the epilepsy program there. I'm a child neurologist that's spent about the past 9 years participating in AHC care and research. And as a result, because of the two hats that I wear, Sharon nominated me to talk about medical marijuana, specifically in epilepsy, and maybe even in applications beyond that. I know the standard tease of a medical talk at a conference is, oh, you know, will it work for this? And I don't mean to give spoilers, generate more questions than I am answers with this discussion. It's just kind of the nature of the beast and where we are with our understanding of medical marijuana and cannabidiol. But keeping that in mind, we'll kind of jump in. I don't know if I got a clicker or something.
He needs volunteers. All right. Okay.
I was going to give the entire talk like this, man. You got any Cheetos? Okay. All right. You can't get away from it. I was going to have like Cheech and Chong. But I only got half an hour, so I had to kind of keep it moving. So disclosures, I don't have any financial, vested financial interest with any of this stuff. I have to emphasize, though, when I talk about therapies with these compounds, I mean, this is on the weakest data that you can imagine. So these are all potential therapies, and maybe a lot of maybes, a lot of could-bes, and a lot of we'll see. But the goals and objectives are fairly straightforward. Just to give a little bit of a history as to how did marijuana get to where it is, the chemistry behind it, some of the social implications that go with it, the unique physiologic kind of reveal that happened with the use of marijuana, which is kind of the clarification of the endocannabinoid system, our own body's capacity to make some of the chemicals that are in marijuana, how that works specifically, its role in neuromodulation, and how that relates to some of the side effects and effects of the different compounds that are out there. And then more specifically, where could this at least potentially be used, and where is it being used in clinical practice, which has essentially happened just over the past few years, especially in regards to pediatric epilepsy. And then lastly, touch briefly on evidence, which is essentially non-existent, into its use outside of epilepsy, and dystonia, and specifically AHC. So this is it. This is a guest of honor right here. Yeah. This is the flowering female marijuana plant, okay? The little beads, the kind of glossy pearls that you see on the surface of the trichromes, that is the content that is ultimately dried, burned, and then inhaled, or pressed and made into an oil and then ingested, or whatever, or ground up and put in a brownie and eaten, okay? That is where most of the chemical compounds are held. That is how we, that is how it's delivered, at least in the artisanal or the plant-based delivery system. Within that are the specific compounds unique to marijuana. That's cannabinoids, and I'm inevitably going to mess up a lot of these words because there's too many syllables. But cannabinoids are the phytochemicals, in other words, the plant-based chemicals that are delivered through its use. There have been at least 60 identified compounds used. The top two are kind of shown in pictographic form on the right. Some of you might have heard of THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol, and then CBD, which has gotten a little bit of notoriety in epilepsy, and that is cannabidiol. Those are the top two most active and most prevalent compounds within the marijuana plant. There's a ton of other ones, okay? Those are all collectively known in that there are 21 carbon compounds. They all have subtle twists in their general structure, but they all kind of share those hexagonal links that you see on the right, and then the tail that extends off to the right. That's kind of the backbone of most of the cannabinoid compounds. Now, THC is the most predominant. It's the one that gets the most notoriety. It is the one that is thought to be most psychoactive. It's the one that results in the high. It is also the one that is thought to be most toxic. Okay, that is the one that they are trying to minimize in medical marijuana use for the most part. And that is in contrast to cannabidiol, which is the predominant player in hemp. Hemp, is, as we'll see, is defined by its low THC content. It is thought to perhaps ameliorate or lessen some of the toxic effects of THC. In other words, it's a counterbalance And it is not thought to be psychoactive. It does not result in a high. There's numerous other compounds, at least 58 other ones, that are all potentially active in their administration. We don't know how. They might interact with each other in negative or positive ways. And we'll talk about that in the next couple slides. So hemp versus marijuana. Hemp has been arbitrarily defined as a low THC component compound. They came up with a 0.3%, and I don't know the history well on that one, where they decided that line in the sand is. But that's what defines it. It is also kind of at least thought to be a separate subspecies of the broader Cannabis sativa plant. So it's thought to be Cannabis sativa subspecies. Sativa is a tall plant that is grown for a variety of industrial purposes: paper, rope, clothing, resin, you name it. It is a tough plant that is durable, and this is in contrast to its perhaps cousin or other subspecies, which is the Cannabis sativa subspecies indica, which is a lower growing plant. In Nebraska, we call it bitchweed. I'm not sure what they call it other places. It has a low fiber content and a highly variable THC composition. Okay, so higher psychoactive potential, but highly variable psychoactive potential. That's interesting because the street content of THC 30 years ago, when they were assessing this, was like 1% THC. More recently, they've estimated it's about 10 times that for the stuff that you can get for recreational purposes on the street, so 8.5% or so. But that ratio is, has some potential therapeutic implications. But it leads to an important social aspect to all this stuff, which is the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, which was passed by President Richard Nixon. The history behind this is kind of interesting in that, this plant has been, used in some capacity since the late 1800s in Mexico. I mean, it had increasingly industrial uses in the early 1900s to the point where it was thought to be, at least in some people's minds, a threat to other industrial forces like the Hearst newspaper empire, the paper empire, the DuPont nylon, plastic-based empire. They saw hemp as perhaps a threat to this, and so somewhere in the 30s and 40s, it became increasingly marginalized, increasingly criminalized. Whether that's actual, legit, it's tough to say. But it just it led to the forces that actually resulted in the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, which set a scheduling classification on specific compounds. Marijuana is technically a Schedule I compound, which means 1, has high abuse potential or high addictive potential. 2, no known medicinal purposes. 3, difficult to guide, guide under medical supervision as far as dosing. How it differs from Schedule II is that Schedule II says, well, yes, there is potential medicinal purposes, things like fentanyl, oxycodone, opiate derivatives. Those are considered Schedule II, and they're known to have medicinal benefit. Marijuana has been kind of blackballed for the past several decades, and we just don't know. The other significant components of this is it defines your penalties. If it's a Schedule I violation, then you go to jail for this long. If it's Schedule II, it results in this penalty, and that holds true whether it's the actual psychoactive component you have in a liquid or it's the plant itself. So, but the interesting physiologic component of this is that we can take these compounds that are within the plant themselves, and back in the 40s when they first discovered THC, maybe it's in the 60s, when they first discovered THC receptor on nerve cells that they didn't know about before. And so once they identified that specific receptor, they started digging deeper, and they realized that we make some of these compounds in our own nervous system anyway, and that is known collectively as the endocannabinoid system. All right, that is our body's own cannabinoid system. And what we found is those receptors, the ones that kind of receive that message. CB1 is predominantly a nervous system, brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves. CB2 is a little bit more peripherally located. It actually has some potential anti-inflammatory effects, some immunomodulatory effects. We're still trying to figure it out, but it's thought to be a little bit more peripheral. There's others too. I mean, there's more than just CB1 and CB2, but they're less well understood, and even what we have here is not exactly well understood. They have an important role in neuromodulation. And neuromodulation is this kind of unique feature of the nervous system. I guess other systems have it as well, but where one nerve cell can influence the activity of its neighboring nerve cells, both in a close proximity and perhaps farther away. And there's multiple mechanisms in this, but it's not just a one-to-one. One nerve cell telling another nerve cell what to do. It's one nerve cell feeding back on itself, spreading a broader message. And that is neuromodulation. They have widespread effects in the brain and body, and that's because these receptors are diffuse. There's a lot of places where they're used. So this is kind of a pictographic depiction. Now, if you imagine kind of nerve transmission, you got a message coming from the left side of the screen going down this nice orange-colored nerve. The message is then released at the edge of that great chasm. It sends a, essentially a carrier pigeon across the way. It's received on the blue, carries the message further downstream. That message is either excitement or inhibition. That's kind of the basic premise of the nervous system. You are either an accelerator or you are a brake. The interesting feature with the endocannabinoid system is, I don't know if I got a pointer on this thing. Is there a pointer? The red button. Okay. So what we have here is this is anandamide. This is something that is actually generated from the cell wall. Dr. George had a nice picture of that kind of lipid bilayer of a nerve cell, and that actually can have the building blocks necessary to make this compound, which is depicted here with this little zigzag. This is an endocannabinoid. This is anandamide, which is oddly enough like Sanskrit for inner bliss, which totally fits, is what the body can make that is a very close mimic to THC. Not exactly the same, because you can see the structure is a little bit different, but same target. So what happens is the body or the nerve cell on the receiving end can generate this signal. It then diffuses back into that Grand Canyon, binds to this Pac-Man structure here, which is that CB1 receptor. That CB1 receptor then tweaks that upstream message by altering, calcium channel function, GABA release, which is the main brake messenger between nerve cells, which is what, for the most part, but what happens is you go backwards and you modify your upstream message so that it's a little bit different. Kind of self-influence neighbors. It's not a real. It's not. But this is how our bodies work. We have significant neuromodulatory capacity, which we're still just trying to figure out. You have widespread CNS effects because they're in places, as well as systemic effects with the CB2. There's retrograde neurotransmission, which gets back to that kind of message. And then it also emphasizes an important part that is at least a little bit more of an argument for the medical marijuana camp, which is this idea of an entourage effect. In other words, there's 60 chemicals that I mentioned that are carried in the plant. The rationale is that the entourage effect is that you need all 60, kind of playing off each other in either positive or negative ways to really get the maximum benefit. Sidestepped a little bit in pharmaceutical grade compositions where you kind of know what you're getting. And when you talk about that entourage effect, it's an amazingly difficult, essentially impossible mechanism to really study, just because how do you take 60 variables and see how many different ways they can interplay with each other. But that is one of the kind of arguments used for the artisanal or the farm-based preparation for medical marijuana, because you need to get all the good stuff in there to really get the maximum benefit. Physiologic impact of the ECS, again, is widespread. This just kind of highlights it. You got pain and sensory modulation. You've got cognitive and memory processing, mood and behavior, motor control, endocrine function, immune regulation, vegetative functions, which are things you don't even think about, your appetite, temperature control, heart rate regulation, things that are on autopilot. All of these in some capacity might be influenced by the endocannabinoid system. Intraocular pressure, everybody hears about, oh, I've got glaucoma, that's why I need my medical marijuana, which, is legit to some extent. Cannabinoids have potential therapy, some that are actually approved for FDA, or at least one of which is approved for FDA anorexia associated, or nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. We'll talk about that in the next slide, but that is one of the anorexia, meaning, inadequate pain, inflammation, again, peripheral CBD or CB2 receptors might have some bearing on this. Neoplastic disease, because it does have immunomodulatory effects at the basis of neoplastic growth that needs to be kind of tamped down. In metabolic processes, there's free radicals that are generated, and you got to figure those are thought to be toxic, and maybe the endocannabinoid system helps clear those out, kind of clean it up. Glaucoma, again, psychiatric and neurologic disease, all have potential impact. Now, with the recreational formulation of the plant-based, you have the potential for some very specific toxicities because you inhale it. Okay? And anytime you inhale a plant-based compound, you have the risk of lung irritation. You have the risk of introducing kind of carriers, whether it's a spore or a fungus or whatever that goes with the formulation, pesticides that have been used that you might not know about, all of those, the interface is at the lung. There's potential complications from that. Tachycardia is in there as well, just with a fast heart rate. Unique to the method of delivery, they might not be the same for an oil, but as it stands the way marijuana is currently used, these are the things you worry about. Now, more specifically related to the nervous system, what we found is that you do longitudinal studies of folks that use a lot of pot, you kind of try and figure out trends, which is not exactly the best way to go about studying a compound, but this is what happens. And you find that those long-term memory impairment, they have, at least in some studies, impaired executive function, kinds of concentration and judgment, attention span, motivation. The whole stereotype of just kind of being, a bump on a log, just there. Impaired motor function with clumsiness and decreased coordination. Again, getting back to the idea that there might be some neurotoxic effects to the different compounds, that THC being neurotoxic, which would impede neuroplasticity or the brain's ability to kind of recover and adjust. Neuropsychiatric stuff, including anxiety, panic attacks, psychosis, whether or not it's for folks that had a predisposition is unclear, but with long-term use, you see that there are higher rates of psychosis. And then manic episodes, a long list. Now, there was an interesting study done just a couple of years ago where they took folks with multiple sclerosis, and they, in their own way, tried to stratify and make sure that you had equal groups. What they found is folks that smoked chronically versus folks that didn't had an entirely different kind of cognitive profile. And what they found is that folks that used it chronically had decreased working memory, had impaired processing speed, and had this impaired executive function. They back this up by looking at functional MRI, which is a way of taking a black and white photo of an MRI, which just looks at the wrinkles of the brain, the structure, where blood flow was. Okay, and that's a way of kind of digging a little bit deeper and looking beyond just the structure of the brain to see how it's working. And what they found is that chronic users had a less anatomically focused, more dispersed activation. I don't want to get into too much of the nuts and bolts of fMRI, but it just shows you that there's a difference. Okay, and this is despite the fact that if you look at the actual MRI itself, the wrinkles were the same, the structure was the same, and the volume about where the blood flow was going. So one of the important things, I'm going to give you a bunch of conflicting information that doesn't have any real concrete conclusions. But one of the things you should take home from this is that medical marijuana is not one thing. Okay, especially when you're talking about artisanal or vernacular products, the stuff that you get from a farm that is grown in batch. Although it is derived from the plant, I just mentioned that there's a ton of variables that go into this. And there's a ton of different ratios that can be involved. There are an extensive variety. Extensive variety of formulations depending on where you get it. There is no standardization. Within growers, they try and do their best to kind of ensure some quality control, but there's a lot of, I guess, buyer beware. It's much like a used car lot. You're not sure what you're going to get. And the content, again, is often poorly specified as opposed to pharmaceutical products, which unfortunately aren't FDA approved just yet in most cases. But what you will hope to get is that, aside from marketing and a clinical trial, you will have highly purified concrete composition that you'll know what you're using. To kind of emphasize that there are, again, myriad preparations. These are just a few examples. Marinol is FDA approved. This is synthetic THC used for chemotherapy-associated nausea and vomiting. Epidiolex is what I've had a little bit of exposure to just because we've participated in a recent trial in its use in drug-resistant epilepsy. It is a bio-derived pure THC component. Sativex is approved in the UK, but not yet approved here in the States. And this is a agent that's used for spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. And it is a 50-50 THC. And there's others, too, that are, for the most part, available in the UK and abroad, but not here. This is in contrast to the artisanal and vernacular, which has multiple modes of delivery. You can smoke it, you can purify it, concentrate it, which is the same as hashish. You can make it into a brownie or a candy, which caused much concern in Colorado since kids were eating these edibles and they had a spike in their marijuana intake. Didn't do an adequate job of kind of labeling what they were selling. And again, you have a highly variable content of the major players. So, getting back to the entourage effect, again, proposed beneficial interactions between the various phytochemicals. You're getting a grab bag of these components, and there's got to be some mystical interplay between them to get you your benefit. It could be true. I don't mean to dismiss it. from a scientific standpoint, it's a tough thing, almost an impossible thing to really pin down with any certainty. And bottom line is, with this interplay, there could be some additive and there could be some inhibitory mechanisms. Again, bottom line, so medical marijuana is not just one thing. So what about medical marijuana specifically in kids? And this is an interesting question where you say, how many controlled trials of medical marijuana, in other words, where you're giving two essentially equal groups of patients, two compounds, one of which is an active or experimental compound and one is not. Okay. Flip side of that is how many lay articles, blogs, advocacy organizations, family groups espouse kind of the benefits of this compound, and there's a ton. And this is justified, especially when you see things like this. So this is Charlotte Figge, who was featured in the CNN expose back in 2013. She's a young lady in Colorado who was the kind of namesake of Charlotte's Web, which is now available. And she has Dravet syndrome, which is a nasty type of epilepsy that results in debilitating seizures and cognitive delays. And she, along with another kind of subject of the expose, were featured because they essentially woke up with this compound. Right? Seizures were greatly reduced. They kind of resumed some, at least more. And you can see either before and after afterwards. And so with such a that Dravet associations across the country mobilized, other epilepsy support groups mobilized, because if you see this, when before you talk to guys like me who would say, well, if you failed 2 to 3 medications for your epilepsy, the likelihood of additional medication trials is low single-digit benefit. People obviously say medical marijuana looks good. Yes. Nope, daily. It was a daily maintenance medication. Yep. So where's the medical evidence? Well, we're starting to accumulate some, especially over the past couple of years. Actual early preclinical studies happened at Utah, oddly enough, one of the most conservative states in the union. Yeah, and then what was found was that the cannabinoids, at least in some seizure models, showed a potential benefit. THC was found to be a little bit more variable in that it might actually be proconvulsant compared to CBD, which was thought to generally be neuroprotective and anticonvulsant. And the other benefit was that in CBD there was no tolerance built up. And so for folks who are dealing with bad epilepsy, you find that you have a honeymoon period of transient response that then kind of fades away as the epilepsy kicks back in. And cannabidiol, at least in preclinical studies, meaning not in humans, it showed that there was no tolerance. But again, to emphasize, to date there is essentially no formal clinical data. Epidiolex is the compound that I've had more exposure to. And this is pure CBD composition with 0 THC. It is synthesized from the plant, so it's not cheap to make, but it is synthesized from the plant by GW. Others out there that are starting up with synthetic compositions that they're trying to study. And we at Utah participated in intermediate-sized studies across the country, where we were allowed some limited patient enrollment that was supported by the drug company as far as providing the compound. It went through the typical channels of an institutional review board to ensure patient safety. We had to go through the extra pain in the butt of getting like additional DEA licenses, because this isn't just like an academic thing. This is an academic and a state government and a federal government thing that you have to wrangle with. So it isn't easy. But what we did was we instituted it, and I have to emphasize that this in and of itself wasn't a controlled trial either. We weren't giving placebo to another group. This was basically a compassionate plea basis where we had families that were willing to give it a shot, knowing that there was risks involved, who were willing to participate in the rigors of a relatively controlled protocol to see if there's any benefit. But again, we didn't take a placebo group and a control group. We just said, hey, we got 25 kids we can enroll. Let's see what happens. And what we found from that was recently published in Lancet Neurology in 2016 by Oren Davinsky, who is the lead author with numerous centers. Utah was in there as well. And what they found that of the 137 patients who ultimately received treatment for at least 3 months through 11 sites, the kind of enrollment composition was about 33 with Dravet syndrome, 31 with Lennox-Gastaut, and the remainder of all sorts of epilepsy types of various flavors. What they found was, which is the lower half of this slide, at 12 weeks, overall median change in total seizures is about 1/3. In other words, seizure burden, at least from motor motor-based countable seizures reduced by a third. As we were talking about earlier in our workshop, when it comes to epilepsy studies, they only count the seizures that they can see. And that's kind of the simplicity of epilepsy trials. So they found it was reduced about a third in general. Now, another way of looking at this, which is the metric of other anti-epileptic medications, that is, if you look at the kids who had at least 50% reduction in their seizures, what number is that? And with this, it was 39%. And this is in the same ballpark of most of the other existing anti-epileptic medications that we have on the market. Okay, between 40, if you're lucky, you're above 50% with that number. So it's at least, in the same neighborhood. They found that there's greater reduction in focal seizures. There might be a little bit of a skew towards this since most seizures are focal by nature. And there was a small percentage of seizure freedom, again, over a short time frame of 3 months, 2%. Overall, this did go up if you just looked at the month leading into that 12-month or 12-week time point. And you have to, again, take this with a grain of salt, too, because the natural course of epilepsy is kind of the hills and valleys, whether you have control or not, or, well, assuming it's not controlled. So, there's a reasonable chance that a small population would have had a month of seizure freedom if you hadn't done anything. As to adverse effects, it showed that, this is something that's fairly well tolerated and not something that is, has a long list of scary side effects. 213 patients were included in this because some didn't actually make it through the treatment protocol. And they have 58.6 patient years of data. What they found is that #1 side effects, somnolence, and that was across the, a good portion of our subjects. They just felt tired. Diarrhea was another one, and that's partly because the suspension that was used is a sesame oil-based suspension, so it softens the stool, gets things running. And then decreased appetite, which seems counter to what you'd expect with marijuana, but the way it goes. As far as serious adverse events, ones that are kind of scary, like status epilepticus, hospitalizations, 20%. That has nasty epilepsy anyway. And of that 20%, only half was thought to be really related to the compound, so 10%. Additionally, only 10% withdrew. Now, this is with a pretty motivated patient population that wanted to see what this does. So they kind of they were, I guess, subject to a little bit of bias as well. But, it shows that at least the vast majority felt the risks were worth the benefit, or the benefits were worth the risks, excuse me. Now, summary statement as to what we're, terminology. We got Epidiolex, which is the only one I think that's really close to having any FDA clearance. I wouldn't be surprised if it's, maybe 2 years away. Don't quote me on that. I mean, that is up to the FDA and it's up to the company itself. But with the rate at which it's moving, I think it's going to be sooner rather than later. In contrast to hemp oil, which again is the artisanal preparation, the stuff you get from different vendors, where it's a little bit of an unknown entity. And the summary statement is this is pharmaceutical. You know what you get. It is only under kind of rigorous study guidance. There is no THC. You have a little more concrete dosing regimen. I can tell you what the dosing regimen is for Epidiolex. I can't tell you all the different formulations that you can get from Oregon or Colorado or Spain or wherever else. I can also tell you that there are ongoing controlled trials where they're looking at it specifically with Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut. We're participating in that as well. It's probably going to be another few years before that actually comes out. All of this is in contrast to the artisanal product of hemp oil that has a little bit more variable quality control, but does at least have the potential for the entourage effect, which you don't get in the distilled pharmaceutical-based or pharmaceutical-grade compound. So it's a trade-off. Now, as to this, as to application of CBD outside of epilepsy, I mean, we know so little, anything's fair game. It has at least a tantalizing mechanistic target with Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease in adults, as well as multiple sclerosis. It might also have benefit in pediatric disease, including autism, Fragile X, dystonia, tics, AHC. We don't know. When it comes to specific to neurologic disorders of movement, this seems to have at least some preclinical basis. In other words, again, they get back to it. You take a group of folks that have Huntington's disease and you ask who smokes pot, and then you see what kind of shakes out. Same thing with Parkinson's. It's far from high quality. And you add that with some preclinical data that at least shows, yes, in mammals, CB1 and CB2 are in centers that control, centers of the brain that control movement, basal ganglia, cerebellum, much like ATP1A3 for AHC, and you say, okay, well, you know, if you look at post-mortem analysis of Huntington's and Parkinson's, we see that these receptors are decreased in number. Okay, is that a primary issue? You know, is that the cause of the problem, or is it just collateral damage from some other process? We don't know. We can say that preclinical data, at least in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and HIV dementia models, shows that, you know, cannabinoids might decrease neurodegeneration associated with these disorders, or they might enhance neuroprotection. And that the, you know, interplay with other neurotransmitter systems like dopamine and serotonin. You know, there's so many moving pieces, it's difficult to kind of tease out. What about AHC? I mean, it's a blank slate. I'd actually ask it if you know, tried medical marijuana just to see what responses you've gotten, but you know, the principles are kind of the same in that motor centers of the brain have ECB1 and CB2. They also have high density of ATP pumps. You know, perhaps there's a potential benefit. To this point, it hasn't been easily based on the mechanisms of Parkinson's and Huntington's as to whether or not agonists or activators versus antagonists or inactivators of these different channels result in expected outcomes. You know, if you enhance CB1, do you decrease the excess movements that are associated with aspects of Parkinson's disease? You know, if you use a blocker, does it improve some of the extra movements? It is highly unpredictable, and there is not a one-to-one correlation. So, I mean, I know that's unsatisfying, but it kind of leaves us with the prospect that there is a huge gap that I think eventually will be filled, especially if we are able to kind of change the scheduling of medical marijuana and turn it from a 1 into a 2, which frees it up and makes it easier for, you know, investigators to figure out what it does. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in the next couple of years, but you know, dare to dream. So, kind of summary is that there's a lot of chemicals in marijuana, and they have a lot of broad diffuse effects. There's a dizzying array of formulations in which this can be delivered, both from pharmaceutical angle as well as from the more natural angle. There is some limited high-quality medical evidence, mainly with that Marinol with the nausea and vomiting, but the remainder is getting better, but still has a long way to go. So, with that, I guess I'll kind of open it up to questions. No questions? Great. Questions now up front?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a question on just the whole, I guess, tone, because it's not you personally, but I mean, if you look at the toxic effects, you know, the slides on toxicity, you stick in ethanol, and you got one compound that causes all and more you know, on a personal level, you could see families all destroyed from this, and yet doctors can go and say on TV like, oh, you should have a few glasses of wine every night. It will help with diet. We talk about this, you know, using pot as if it's some kind of thing. It's just, you know, to me, it's insane that it's not being given, not by us, but by the government and by all the people who, you know, kind of persecute it as being something so horrific. And if I asked the psychiatrist about it, and she looked at me like I slapped her in the face, you know, and I told her, look, my kid's aggressive. I don't know many people who get stoned and then go out looking for fights, but alcoholics, yes. And my Topamax has destroyed my kid's appetite. He's 106 pounds, skinny as a snake, and you know, this might increase his appetite. You know, without the THC, yeah, maybe it didn't. And you know, so a lot of these things, they seem like things that are worth investigating, but the government still is not letting us look at it in a realistic, scientific, you know, enlightened way, and that upsets me. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if it'll do anything, and I'm not claiming to. But it just does. You see what I'm getting at?
Oh yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
I've never had a kind of a window into the absurd like I did during the ramp up to our implementation of this trial. I mean, I had weekly meetings. I and my boss, who I thank for a lot of this content because he was actually the point of the spear in Utah as far as getting it through, Dr. Franfew. And you know, we had to sit in these administrative boardrooms with their fancy wooden tables and, you know, play through all the scenarios of what happens with this compound. And all the while we're sitting in, you know, Utah, which has one of the highest rates of prescription drug abuse in the country, you know, with things that are Schedule II, with those things. And we're, you know, dedicating hours and hours of talking about all the different layers that go with this compound's use. I mean, as a highlight, in Utah, we had a very active family group who were very effective in getting our legislature to kind of push through this bill, which allowed families to, you know, carry their hemp card and not get arrested if they had it on. The challenge was, you know, they just passed a state law which allows this, but when it comes to these compounds, and so when you enter a hospital, which is a federally accredited institution, how does that work? I mean, does that hospital lose accreditation because you have a banned substance, albeit one that seems to be entirely benign? I mean, these were just the scenarios we had to play through. And so what I took away from that was that there's way more stigma with this than is really warranted, at least based on my kind of, you know, diving into a little bit of literature. And so I agree with you. I have to counter that with saying, you know, in our medical training, it is hammered into us as best as we can to control the variables that we can control and assess what kind of results from a single isolated change. Okay, you change one variable in two entirely equal groups and don't tell them what happened, and you see what the outcome is. And so when we talk about, when you mentioned this, you know, when you kind of talk about medical marijuana, I mean, that's not one variable. So it puts us in a precarious position where as physicians, you know, they initially wanted us to write letters saying, yeah, try medical marijuana. It seems like it's a good idea, where, you know, that's a position that we can't take. I mean, it's probably fine. We don't have a basis to make that decision because, you know, this is a really weird compound that totally circumvented the established pathways to getting things through. I think it's going to prove to be a legitimate tool to use, but man, there's a lot of drama on the way.
Yeah, the obstacles to look at it is what's insane.
I agree.
You know, the results, who knows? But just throwing all these obstacles in the way. I mean, flunerizine's not allowed in the U.S. So, I mean, everybody here is giving their kids flunerizine probably. Anyway, that was my rant.
You're not alone. Not alone at all.
I have some questions on your study. Number one, I don't know if I missed it, but did anybody have no reaction in your?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't actually publish that, but boy, I can speak to R25, and there's, you know, 5 or 6, just as a rough estimate, that didn't really change much.
And how many? I don't know if you did this, but how many actually responded to traditional medications for seizure? Did you do a conventional medication versus?
No, but as a point of entry into the study, you had to be kind of in the worst of the worst, you know, drug resistant, which means you had frequent uncontrolled seizures.
Okay, so these were intractable seizures.
Yeah.
These were just a mixed population. Okay.
We had to kind of establish inclusion criteria based on number of drugs failed, frequency of seizures, those kind of things.
All right. Okay, great. Thanks.
So, Matt, I just wanted to share with medical marijuana. So, a lot of dystonia with the hemiplegia, and also she has. So we decided to try medical marijuana from not Epidiolex, but Sativex, which has 50% THC and 50% CBD, because some studies had shown that perhaps that would work on the dystonia, which is her major problem. We tried it twice for 2 months, and it didn't really work on the episodes, the hemiplegia or the dystonia, but we did see an increase in her cognitive behaviors. Her brain was working better. So she was putting together words, so her sentences became longer, for instance, from maybe 3 to 4 words to 10 words. So we saw it was not a study, but we saw this difference. So we decided to stop the Sativex, and we're going into Epidiolex. We don't have it yet. It took us 18 months to get it legally, and she's the first one to try it in Iceland of all the patients in Iceland. So next is to get the Epidiolex, which is probably easier because it doesn't have any THC. But I just wanted to let you know that this is at least our experience. So it didn't work on the seizures. It didn't work. Well, we don't know about the seizures actually, but it didn't work on the hemiplegia or dystonia. But we did see positive reactions from it. Nothing negative though.
And I kind of back that up with some of the anecdotal reports on the folks in our study, is that there's a good handful who felt that their seizures might not have been significantly altered, or at least drastically, but they did feel that there might be some cognitive benefit. We were only one of the 11 institutions, and I think we're going to try and sift through that to see if there is any of that secondary data that can be mined from all that was collected. But I would say that, yeah, that was I heard that quite a bit with the patients that we'd see.
So I commiserate with you about the DA walking to my office with the gun and all that. You were having a meeting with me. It's a little pressure. But anyway, so I just want to share with you, I learned in Seattle and Washington, people have been using CBD to the yin-yang for the longest time. And I have a huge population with the genetic epilepsies, and the parents got frustrated and just went on their own and tried to get stuff. But there's a couple of things for you who are just thinking in terms of behavior that you want to be mindful about it. One, THC for the most part is not that great. Just go around and talk with those families. You're going to see the more THC they have, the more the kids are. They are a little de-repressed, you know what I mean? So especially the kids with the more disability don't handle that very well, man. And so for the most part, my experience has been that it's not better. There's a lot of worse, actually, with those high THC compounds. And like Matt said, it drives you cuckoo, the fact that you don't know exactly what you're dealing with. So you clearly have people who have 2, 3%, 10%, and they go to the store and say, oh, yeah, man, and one of the stores is just like between my work and my nearby. And she always just like, oh, yeah, people came from there, and they go to in its schools. And so it is bad. It's not great. Appetite, for the most part, has been not positive in the high CBD compound. Has been either neutral, a little negative. In Europe, a lot of the industry that's playing around with that is actually doing compounds to decrease your appetite. The biggest sales there is just getting synthetic compounds and have the reverse of the effect of the THC. And the CBD is a little bit on that. And the CBD has some of the immune effect that we don't understand that very well. And we hope it's not going to be a big deal. But I mean, so far we don't understand that great. The seizure frequency has varied a little bit. I think it's a cool anti-anxiety medication if you can keep that without THC. In fact, the incidence of the teenagers up here in the ER crazy after smoking pot it tends to correlate pretty well with how much CBD there is in the pot. So over the past 10 years, those of us who train in pediatrics have seen more and more kids coming to the ER, either having a seizure or just having an anxiety attack, or both. And that correlates to high THC in the pot that they smoked. And in Europe, they are very worried about people who get psychotic after smoking pot, because that correlates with a tendency for psychosis. So you shouldn't be insisting on that. So there are several studies in the European Union showing that. And so you should be careful that even though CBD is a little antipsychotic, THC is not. It's the reverse. If anything, will drive you, probably if you have a genetic tendency for it. So just a couple things, words of caution on that, even though there is some literature on that. You've got to be careful what they're really using, man, because like you said, I mean, we are all of us, the docs too. I mean, as you hear, that we are under a lot of scrutiny, and so the psychiatrists are just starting to study that. But you want to be not using a lot of THC. That's what I got from learning, from talking, sitting down with parents and say, hey man, tell me what you're giving your kid. In Seattle, I have them go see a naturopath. That's the way out that they do, but that's what the parents tell me, and I've learned. So,
interestingly, to follow up on that, in the conclusions of that Davinsky paper, I kind of cited the one that actually has been more recent. They highlighted that the FDA did a quality check on six vendors of CBD oil, and 2 of them had no detectable CBD in their compound. So I mean, it is truly a buyer beware aspect. The other thing I want to point out, just because I mean, folks here aren't necessarily living in the epilepsy world, but with these compounds, there is potential for drug interactions. In other words, if you are on things like clobazam, if you're on things like Depakote, there is some potential metabolic competition that would result in an unexpected rise in those medications. And so, if you're going to kind of take that step on your own, just beware that if you have other meds on board, you have to be vigilant. It might require some blood monitoring just to make sure, because as much as the seizure reduction is in the same ballpark as existing medications for seizures, it's also in the same ballpark for having liver inflammation, drug interactions, those kind of baggage with any of the chemical compounds.
So I just wanted to make a brief comment that we have a teenager with AHC who's recently tried it that could talk to us about it. She's one of our most verbal AHC patients, so it would be good to get her feedback. But this is another plug for if you are going to try that and you have an experience, we've got to find a way to document some reports even when they're not, for rare disorders, even if it's anecdotal experience, it's better than no experience, and how to collect that data as a community is an ongoing issue. Because I have a number of other patients with rare genetic disorders that have been on pot in various forms, all sorts of different combinations, and I've had several ER visits. So I've had a status episode, I've had paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, tremors, agitation. So my experience is about 50-50. Sometimes they feel better, sometimes it's really bad. But that's mostly the mixtures, and you don't know what's actually in it. So.
I know you were looking at more like stopping seizures or in the event that they tried it for AHC, but he mentioned anxiety. Do you think there's any potential benefit to reducing anxiety, which causes the alternating hemiplegia attack?
I think there's potential benefit to investigating its role in anxiety, whether as an anxiolytic, stopping it, or is it a pro-anxiety agent? We are so early in this game, I can't make any assessments other than, yeah, it's definitely worth targeting.
And this didn't have any THC, but I've heard from different sources that just a tiny bit of THC might be helpful for the anxiety. Is that going to be investigated at all for, treatment?
I am sure at some point people are going to start breaking down the different ratios between the two, just because, Sativex is 50-50, and you got CBD on one end, which is 0. I've had folks come to me, and I don't know if other epilepsy folks have seen, families that are adamant that they need just a THC rider on with their CBD, just to, just whatever that content is. Okay. Do they? And they seem to be further ahead than others. I mean, I got
Charlotte's Web, which is the Colorado source, they do have a touch of THC, 0.9% or less. But again, I'd say overall, there's no data for anything you've heard about, good or bad. It's all anecdotal. So you should study it. You should lobby your politicians. Remove this from Schedule 1 so we can get the answer. This is a bipartisan blockage, and I know it's frustrating, but this is the time to do it. If you guys want change, you have to have the legislature change it. It'll probably take an executive order by the next president to do it, and I think they would do it because most people are really behind it. It's a political issue, and it's silly. Sorry, but I'm sick of these things.
I just want to make a very quick comment, Matt. I think you stressed something very critical here for the families to think about, and that is our regulatory process for getting any drug approved. Like you said, it goes through an incredible rigorous process to do that. This is a drug that is going to require an incredible amount of studying, which means that we're not even near close to anything right now available for AHC in the sense of even to a trial point. Not only that, but I think AHC being as complex as it is and trying to find that group that we could match with even a control group, it's also very challenging, right? So when we think about a control group, we also have to think about what does that mean? It means somebody who's not affected by AHC or the syndrome that you're trying to test it on. How many controls are we going to be able to really get to try something like marijuana right now? So, you know, it's something for all of us to think about. It's not as easy, right? It's not an easy answer, but it's really what we're facing right now, and that's what every state is facing. And it depends on how strict they are, but for the most part, we're dealing with a drug that has an incredible amount of side effects. That's putting it pretty good. Where it could be less than that when it comes to an effect on any kind of disease or disorder.
And to add to that, the increasing challenge is that you guys can go get CBD wherever, and as a result, the population of folks that haven't had some exposure, at least with similar neurologic conditions, who haven't had exposure to some other form of CBD or THC gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that makes the viable patient pool who can be participating in this trial smaller and smaller and smaller. It's kind of putting the cart before the horse, but that's the way it is. True. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, but we do really have to cut this off. We're going to, I appreciate your presentation, Matt. Let's give him a hand.